This is my first time here. It's incredible. We walked around Verona last night. My wife's here with me, and this city is beautiful. Are most of you in particular like from Verona? Or are you from other parts? How many are from Verona? Man, your city's beautiful. I love it. Okay, so quick introduction. My name is Zack Argyle. I work at Pinterest. I've been there for almost 4 years now, and it doesn't sound like very long, but the company is only about 8 years old, so I've been there longer than like 85% of the rest of the company. So it's changed a lot since I've been there. It was 300 people, now it's 1,500 people, and still continuing to grow a lot. So it's been really fun, and I've got to work on a lot of different projects. Currently, I am the manager for the web platform team. So we manage like the web servers and a lot of the architecture and infrastructure for the web. And I previously was the tech lead when we redid our mobile website. So that's what I'm going to be talking about in particular today is why Pinterest loves the mobile web. And it's a long story, so it'll be fun. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about first the story and then how we did it, and that'll include things like performance. And then at the end, we'll talk about the results of that rewrite. So this was a from-scratch rewrite. So we did not reuse any code. We actually wrote a linter that disallowed importing from the desktop code base because we wanted to make sure that performance was important there. So we're going to talk about the results of actually finishing that and what it did. Spoiler, it was really good. Okay, so the story. And sorry if this is like totally ridiculous. It's supposed to be. It was a dark night in the beginning of 2015. The Pinterest mobile web experience had been neglected and left to fester in San Francisco. Told you it's bad. We came to a fork in the road. Do we invest more in improving the mobile web, or do we upsell the native app? I'm sure you've seen that before. I think Yelp. I think they're starting to move away from it, hopefully. So what we ended up choosing was that we were going to go with the dark side, and we were going to upsell the native app. We actually ran a lot of experiments to determine what we wanted to do, and at that point in time, our native app performed way better than our mobile web app. So we said, hey, we're just going to push people to the native app. In the long run, we actually get a lot better engaged users, so we're just going to like totally forget about mobile web altogether. It's going to be pretty much as a landing page to send you to the native app. And so there was two things in particular that we did to upsell the native apps. The first was a full page app upsell. So regardless of what page you went on, this is what you saw. Actually later on, like we allowed you to scroll down to see more, but this is not a great experience when you're going on like Google search and you type in cute kitty cats and you try to go to Pinterest to see a stupid kitty cat and you can't even see the kitty cat. So this was not a great experience, but it worked in getting people to install the app. The second thing that we did was if you were to scroll down, anything that you clicked on would take you to the native app. So it was automatic deep linking into the native app. Now, that's nice if you have the native app, but if you don't have the native app, what does it do? It sends you to the App Store. And the best part is, if you download the app, you don't even get to see the kitty. It sends you to the App Store, you download it, and then you don't even get deep linked to the thing you wanted to see in the first place. So the experience was not great. Oh yeah, I'm supposed to read this in my dramatic voice. I stood on a dark road, displeased yet content with the decision we had made. It was the right thing to do at the time, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someday we would revisit this decision. That someday things would change. I'm happy to say they have changed. But it turns out I was not the only one who felt that this was a bad user experience. There's actually a lot of people, and there's actually been some like Reddit threads that were very big about how Pinterest has ruined like Google search and stuff, and a lot of this is related to our old mobile web. But I went on Twitter and I found some people who shared my thoughts about how that experience was not good. And I want to share some of those tweets with you. Pinterest mobile web experience is a nightmare. I'm not going to read all of them. There's a lot. We're gonna go through all of them. It's going to be great. Pinterest is an evil curse on the mobile web. Wow, Pinterest is such a dick on mobile web. And then my two favorites are coming up. This is the worst. I don't want to have to download an app just to look at pictures of cupcakes. I don't want to either. I get it, Steph. And my favorite, you have the stupidest mobile web version. It's non-existent. I don't want to download your super fast, stupid app. Suck it. Noted, Ahmed. And so this is where I felt at that moment. I was like, okay, not great. Things aren't going great. But at the same time, like, our metrics told us that this was the right decision to make. So this is something that I want all of you to take away, if nothing else from this talk, is this slide. It is very, very big right now in the industry to run experiments for everything you do and to let the metrics decide what's best. But one thing that metrics do not measure is sentiment. And that's especially important as you aggregate multiple experiments on top of each other. That sentiment cost aggregates as well. Yeah, so if nothing else from this talk, I want you to take this home. Metrics do not measure sentiment. That doesn't mean that you should not listen to metrics. Obviously, metrics are super important, especially when you're running experiments. But it means that you do have to check yourself. And so this was one of the things that we wanted to think about going forward. So I'm happy to announce that things have changed. Pinterest is not terrible anymore. And so we're going to talk about like why we ended up doing that. And it wasn't just sentiment, right? Sentiment is great. We want people to be happy, but we also, like, we're a business. We're trying to make money. We're hopefully trying to go public someday. So we have to have users and we have to have money, right? So like metrics kind of determine all of that. So those are important. But there was other reasons other than just the sentiment cost for the reasons why we decided to invest in mobile web. And the first is like kind of one of the main benefits of the web in general, and that's its accessibility. And I'm not saying accessibility for like a blind person. I'm saying the accessibility of your app itself. So like the findability of your app. Native apps have the inherent flaw that they are hard to find. They're hard to discover. But web apps are like really easy to find. A website, right? You just go in Google search and like there's this beautiful way to find pretty much anything on the web. And so that accessibility is really, really beautiful. And it ties in second with the second one, which is SEO. Pinterest is really, really good at SEO. And part of it's because our service has a lot of content and it's all user generated and there's a lot of good things. And third is the opportunity size. So this is one that is starting to be talked about a lot in the industry. That is the opportunity size of mobile web and specifically like building a progressive web app. So I want to talk about, so I did have a couple notes in here. So like the accessibility, one of those is like the size of your mobile web app versus a native app. So I have written down here, our mobile web app currently, as of today, is about 150 kilobytes if you're like downloading the home feed. On the iOS app, it's 56 megabytes to see the exact same home feed. So like that change is humongous, right? So it's lightweight. That's a beautiful thing about accessibility. Okay, so talking about that opportunity size. This is a diagram of our conversion rate of the old mobile web. So this is somebody who like came from Google search. They land on Pinterest mobile web, and some way or other they sign up or log in. That is 1%. 1% of people who were not signed up or logged in previously went on to sign up or log in. And a big part of that was because we were pushing them to use the native app. That means that not only did they need to sign up or log in, they needed to download the app. It actually was possible to sign up on mobile web previously, but it was actually like really hard to find. There was like little, like you had to like click like 4 or 5 different things and kind of like hack your way to it. So the main way was to download the native app and then sign up. And there was a lot of people who downloaded the native app, realized you had to sign up, and then just deleted it. So 1% of those people, that is not good. That is a very, very bad conversion rate. If you're into metrics, that is not the kind of thing you want to see. And this was not for a small amount of people. Like we have a lot of traffic, like tens of millions of unauth users visiting Pinterest every single day. So this was a lot of people that we were missing out on. Secondly, and if we want to talk about opportunity size, one that people talk a lot about specifically with mobile web is India. This is a chart about India's internet user size. I don't know if you can see these numbers, but in 2018, they've got 370 million internet users. That's a lot of users in just one country. And the reason why we talk about mobile web in India is because they don't like to download apps. Their network speeds aren't great. They don't want to download things. Their phones are often not as good, so they don't want to have a heavy app on their phone. So they love these progressive web apps, these lightweight, accessible things. So here's a quick sneak peek of Pinterest's growth in India after launching our progressive web app. And that is 273% year-over-year growth. And it has not even been a year yet, which means that until about July or August, that number will continue to rise. And that's a pretty good graph, right? That's the kind of thing you want to see when you make a big investment. All right, and I kind of mentioned these already. Basically, some people prefer to not download apps, and you should allow them to not. Okay, so now that you've decided to invest in mobile web, there's a couple questions that you have to ask yourself, and I think a big one, and one that I hear a lot from other people, is should I make my site responsive, or should I make a separate mobile website? And they ask me this because they know that Pinterest decided to fork their code base for desktop and mobile web, and a lot of them are like, well, responsive sites, like that's what it's all about, like that's like the craze, right? And there's a lot of good things about having a responsive site, but there are a lot of downsides as well. My recommendation is if you have more than 20 web engineers on your team, you should have a dedicated mobile web app. And I want to talk about a couple reasons why I like having a separate app. First is, one thing that I've seen throughout my career is that mobile web just breaks all the time because nobody tests it. Like they build something for desktop and then mobile web breaks and you don't find out for like a month later and then you're like, oh my gosh, how long has this been broken for? So that's one big benefit is like now you can like build stuff for desktop and you don't have to worry about anything breaking on mobile web and vice versa. Mixed in with that is less logical complexity. So that means that in your desktop code base, you no longer have is mobile, do this, is mobile, switch from this width to this width, right? All over the place. So you can kind of optimize exactly for what you want, which actually ends up making your bundle sizes smaller for each of the individual code bases. A third, additional surface for experimentation. There are things that you want to experiment for on mobile web that you don't want to have to experiment for on desktop web. For example, we just recently ran a data saver experiment for people who have like the data saver header set, and that's not something that anyone cares about on desktop. They've got Wi-Fi, like they don't need to worry about like how much they're downloading. Whereas on mobile web, when you have your network connection, like you want to make sure that you're not downloading too much if you have that set. Also, you can optimize for touch surfaces. Pinterest mobile web is very, very touch friendly and accessible in general. And when you're building for desktop web, that's not something that you want to have to think about. Is someone like touching it because it's a completely different experience. That said, there are two things that I think are important to note. I mean, the first is this maintenance cost. And that's the one like everyone's like, okay, well, if you're forking your app, like there's now this whole other code base that I have to keep track of and have bugs for. Which is why I say like you need to have a certain number of web engineers on your team before you decide to fork, before the benefits outweigh the maintenance cost. And one of those maintenance costs is this routing gets trickier. And what I mean by that is now you've got two separate code bases. So if you add a route to desktop web and someone visits that route on mobile web and you didn't add that route on mobile web, what's it going to do? I don't know. On Pinterest, for example, all of our URLs are like pinterest.com/username, which means that we have that slug as that first end to the URL, which means that anything that you miss, it's going to assume is a user. So any route that you forgot to add that you created on desktop web, that doesn't exist on mobile web, it's going to assume it's a user, and it's going to like have some weird error about like that user not existing, and people are going to be really confused. So that's just part of the maintenance cost. All right, so I'm going to talk about some things specifically for if you are starting from scratch. One of the things that I think is the biggest benefit to starting from scratch and forking for your mobile web is that you get to enforce best practices. Now, this is really, really important and something that people don't often do when they're starting out at the beginning, but I think is probably, arguably, the most important thing to think about when you're starting a new project is how do I enforce, one, consistency throughout the app, two, accessibility, and that is talking about people with disabilities, and three, performance. So I'm going to talk about some of the things that we've done to enforce best practices for consistency, accessibility, and performance. The first is we've got a component library, and these are some of the things that we have. So we use React at Pinterest. It's perfect for building out a component library. And this image shows some of the components that we have. So we've got one called Box, and Box handles all of our layouts. It's got things like margin right, margin left. It handles all of our CSS. Actually, on our new mobile web, we have 0 external CSS. It's just the style sheet for the component library. And we have about, I think, less than 10 HTML components, and everything else is a component from our React component library. So that means like we've got less than 10 things like div. There's like, I think, 6 divs, and we always have those because you need like to grab a ref or something. And so this is great for enforcing consistency, right? It's also great for enforcing other things like performance and accessibility because you can bake into your components, you can bake into them all the accessibility issues that you might see. You can bake into them all the consistency things. If you have like a design language for your company where you're going to like make sure only certain colors should be used, you can bake those into the components, which is really nice. Here's another example of some of those images that we have, or some of those components that we have. I am happy to announce that last month we officially open sourced our component library. If you want to go check it out, you totally can. It's called Gestalt. So it's github.com/pinterest/Gestalt. Totally feel free to check out any of the source code. I think it's pretty well done in general. You can see the things that we've done to enforce consistency and such. On mobile web in particular, we have more components that we built to enforce consistency. And I think these have been arguably the most beneficial thing that we did on mobile web, and it made things really, really easy. So we have some of these interesting components like page container, and that's this gray one around the edge that handles borders, like border margins everywhere, so that every page has the exact same margins everywhere. It also works with fixed header. So if you put a header on your page, then you can say on page container add has header, and then it'll shift everything down for you automatically. Just some of those like nice little things like that. Full width breaks you out of that page container. We have a feed factory function that it returns a feed. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Then fixed headers and fixed footers. And then one big one that we have for mobile web is called tap area. And this one is the one that makes Pinterest feel really, really good. It's actually funny because when I show people our mobile web app, when it's like on your home screen and you get the full screen like PWA version, they don't know that it's a mobile website. They think that it's an app because it feels really good. And the reason it feels so good is performance and tap area. Tap area handles things like compressing a pin when you touch it, so it gets slightly smaller, and adding like background colors around things when you touch them. So adding those like press states to things. And that's part of that accessibility and enforcing accessibility. Okay, so here's some examples of touch optimizations that we did. There was actually some very subtle things that were here as well. If you look over at the far right side where I'm just touching the navbar icons, the touch of the navbar icon and the routing are actually not tied together. And so you don't have to wait for like the color to change on the navbar icon before the page changes routes. And that's just like a really small thing, but it feels a lot better because you want that color to change as soon as you touch it. The pull to refresh feels very native. and then that like same like touch compression on items feels really, really good. All right, so I mentioned that createFeed. We use this for any feed on Pinterest. Like there's a home feed one. This one is related pins. So if you go to like a pin page where they have like the big image and then like the related pins below it, this is literally all it looks like. And that's how you use it. Our home feed page was just like 10 lines at one point. All it was just this create feed, and it created a home feed, and then it rendered the home feed component. And that was it. The benefits of this are not just that it's like easy to make it, but it provides consistency for all of your feeds. So there's like the same like grid spacing for everything, and you don't have to think about what's being rendered. The feed will look at all of the items that get passed into it, and it will render whatever it needs to, which is actually really cool. So at this point, I'm still a little bit in the dark, but we've now got this beautiful, beautiful pony that we've created. But the problem is it's no racehorse. That was a bad joke. Yeah, so we've created this like consistent, beautiful experience that's like all based around the UI, but the performance isn't there yet. So we've started to change what people think, right? It's no longer the, oh, you can't even see that. It's grayed out. It said worst before, now it says best. It's the portal to the best of mobile web UX. All right, so next is performance. If you're very interested in performance, Adi Osmani did a deep dive case study of some of the things that we did, and I would highly suggest going and finding it out and reading through it. It's a pretty long article. We worked very, very closely with him, so he has a lot of like code snippets from our code base if you're interested in those, things like what our Webpack configs look like. Highly suggest it. It's a very, very good article and lots of good information. I'm going to talk about a couple of the things in there. First is whenever you talk about performance on the web, one of the main things you talk about is page load, and a huge part of that is all about the size of your bundles. We use Webpack, and we split our bundles into 3 categories. First is our vendor bundle that has things like React, has things like Redux, has things, we have one called Normalizer is in there. Then there's an entry chunk, and that's got like a lot of the core components and like the shell for the app. And then all of our routes are split out into separate async chunks, as well as some things that are not routes, but things that should not be loaded up front. And we actually did an interesting optimization here that I would suggest. You can't really see this very well because it's not very big. Essentially, what it is on the right side, or sorry, on your left side, you can see the top left and bottom left. They're kind of smaller squares. Essentially what those are like the entry chunk and the page. And so what we did was, instead of having all of our pages smaller, so this full left side is all like vendor and entry chunk stuff. And all of these ones on the right side going forward, like the bigger boxes, or like the medium-sized boxes, are all pages. So like all of the things that a page has in its route bundle. And what we did was, we made some very small changes to our Webpack config that basically said anything in our library directory that we have for mobile web, or anything that shows up more than 3 times across those pages, stick it in the entry chunk. So move it to the left side. And so the right side is what it looked like after we made that change. And essentially what it did is it increased the size of the entry chunk by 20%, but decreased the size of all of the pages by about 90%, which is an interesting trade-off because it might end up actually making the initial page load slightly slower. It actually ended up not really changing the initial page load a whole lot, but the follow-up like transitions when you're loading an async chunk were super, super fast because they went from like, I don't know, 20 kilobytes down to like 5 sometimes. Or our home feed at one point was like 1 kilobyte for our home feed page, which is pretty crazy. So I guess one of the things that I'd mention here is there's no like one-size-fits-all solution for how you should split out your chunks, but you should test. You should see what it looks like. and see how page load is affected. And you should think about your users as well. One of the benefits of shifting it over to this one on the right side is that the user actually ends up downloading less data. And that was something that was important for us. We wanted to make sure that the people who were using mobile web were getting a good experience without sacrificing data. I'm going to go ahead and skip this, but we have a way of preloading bundles as well. So like if you're on like a close-up page and you might end up like repinning this thing, the repin page is a separate one, so you can repin that. You can preload that repin page. I would also suggest there's a talk, I think today, talking about, I think it's Lighthouse-driven development. I don't know if the teacher's here somewhere. Is a teacher here? Lighthouse-driven development? Not here right now. Go to that. I think it's going to be really cool. We used Lighthouse for a lot of our audits. It does things like performance, accessibility, a lot of information about like your service worker configurations, and best practices in general for the web. And it's really, really helpful. It gives you a lot of good information about your bundle sizes and about how your performance is going. So I would highly suggest using that. If you don't know what Lighthouse is, go to that talk. But the gist is it's a tool that is now baked into Chrome DevTools, but it's also a Chrome extension, and there is a Node library that you can use if you want that will run your site through a bunch of different tests and tell you how it's doing as far as like best practices and performance go. So jumping back over to some performance stuff, this is something that's really important. I'm not going to go too deep into it. It's a big topic, but grid virtualization. How many of you have heard of virtualization before? Okay, not very many of you, so maybe I'll talk a little bit about it. So the idea is you have this like huge list of items that you're showing, but you're really only showing a small chunk of them at any given time. And your browser is actually going to render everything. So with infinite scrolling, you end up having like 1,000 items in your list, or like even more, right? As you continue to scroll, and it's really, really heavy for the browser to do all of that rendering because it's still there. It's still in the HTML. And so what virtualization says, I'm going to window. So it's called windowing, and it's going to look at what is on screen, and it's not going to render any of the other stuff. And it does some like interesting tricks to like basically pad everything up until that point and then pad afterwards, so you still get like the scroll bars that are correct. And the big benefit of this is performance. Like you can now have 1 million items that you're rendering, but you're not actually rendering anything except for maybe like 6 or 7. And so you get perfect performance, and you get no stutter as you're scrolling because the browser is only showing you exactly what's there. And there's often a little bit of over scroll when doing windowing, because if you don't allow things to be rendered like a slightly above and slightly below, then you'll end up getting like weird white blank spots for like, I don't know, maybe 100 milliseconds or so. So they'll do like a little buffer on either side. But this is something you should look into if you're interested in performance. If you have any kind of grid or scrollable list that has lots of items, look into virtualization. There's pretty much a library or component for virtualization in any framework that you're using. There's ones for Polymer, there's ones for Angular, there's ones for React, etc. I mean, there's ones for jQuery, whatever you want to do. So look up virtualization. It's really, really cool and interesting, and arguably the most important thing you can do for any kind of grid performance. All right, so I want to touch on. We don't have a whole lot of time, and I want to leave some time for questions as well. But one thing that we did for performance that was really, really important is called normalization. The idea being, actually, we'll just go through. I think this will explain it better. So the idea of normalization is essentially you've got some object that you get back from the server. So in this example, I have a pin. It's got a bunch of different fields. It's got an ID and image. It's got a board. It's got a original pinner with some information. Essentially what this is it's a pin. It's got a board. The board has an owner, which is a user, and the original pinner is also a user. So it's got a pin, a board, and 2 users. And so what normalization does is instead of giving me this object all put together in one big clump, it's going to split them out or normalize them. I don't know if you can, I mean, it's not too big, but I think you get the idea there. So it's going to split them out. We use Redux at Pinterest, and there are really, really good Redux dev tools. If you've never used Redux before, you should install the Redux dev tools just to try it out, because the dev tools are like so cool. We actually have the dev tools enabled for Pinterest's mobile web in production. So if you want to check out how we do things, you can see all of the actions that are going through our Redux stores, and you can see all of our data. And you'll see how everything is normalized. So you can't really see this very well, but there's a pins section. This is essentially like a client-side database. So there's a pins section, and the pin will have like original pinner, and it'll be just an ID. And the ID will point to the user section down here, where that ID will be a key, and there will be the rest of the user information for that original pinner. So it normalizes everything, puts it into this essentially client-side database, which allows for some really, really cool things. I mean, there's little things that are less important, like memory efficiency in the web. We don't often care a whole lot about that, but this is more memory efficient, because if I, for example, am scrolling through like a feed on Pinterest, I've got a bunch of pins, and if I click on a pin, then I'm going to go to like this close-up view, and so I'm going to go like fetch more data. I actually have a lot of that data already, but if I go and fetch that one and I don't normalize it, then I've actually essentially got 2 copies of the same pin. And so normalizing says, just take all that new stuff I got and merge it in with all the old stuff that I already had. And so now I've got like this single source of truth for that specific pin, which is awesome. And that's essentially what this is saying is, you go make a request, the response comes back, you split it out into its parts, it runs through, I mean, we called it an entity reducer, or whatever you want to call it. I'm not going to go into like all the Redux stuff, so maybe I'll just skip this slide. We're short on time anyway. Yeah, we'll skip that too. One of the biggest benefits of this normalization is it made going from the feed to the close-up really, really fast. Because I don't need to wait for the rest of the information to come back from the server. Right? I can click on that pin, I can show the close-up page with all of the information for the pin that I already have, and then when I get the new information, when I get the rest of it, I can just fill in the blanks that I don't have. Which also means that if I'm offline, you can still click on a pin and go to the close-up, even if you're offline. And so you can see those bigger images, which is pretty cool. Let's skip that one. And all right, this next section is about progressive web apps. How many of you are familiar with the term or the technologies related to progressive web apps? Okay, we got a lot of hands there. Cool. How about service workers? How many of you are familiar with service workers? How many of you have ever written your own service worker? We got a couple brave souls. It's not fun. It is really not fun. That's why there's a lot of like build tooling and stuff around generating service workers. I actually open sourced one through Pinterest. So if you go to github.com/Pinterest/service-workers, we've got some that generate service worker files that we use, specifically to allow us to experiment with service workers. So you can generate any number of service workers from your Webpack config. So if you're not familiar with service workers, essentially the idea is you've got your website and you've got your network or your like web server, right? I wanna fetch for some data essentially, and the service worker sits in between those two. And what that means is that any request that you send out, be it for data or for an asset like a script or a CSS style sheet, that's going to go through your service worker first, and it's going to go through your service worker on the way back. And the cool thing about that is that now you have this separate entity that is not actually exactly related to your website, that's actually going to be able to run when no one is even on your website, that has access to a cache of things that have gone through it. And the cool thing about that is that, let's say I go to Pinterest.com and I've got this service worker running. I can cache all of the scripts and the style sheets that have been fetched, and the next time someone comes back, I don't even need to go to the server. And the cool thing about that is it enables you to have websites that work offline and websites that just work fast if you are online. One of the beautiful things is that they are now supported in all of the major browsers officially. Give a round of applause for that. It's been a long time coming. There are still some quirks in some of the browsers, so I wouldn't say it's like 100% functionality. But I mean, I've got an iPhone, and I've been using the like beta versions of iOS for the last couple months, and there's some like really weird quirks with like adding a PWA to your home screen, but it looks really nice. It just doesn't work very well. Yeah, I'm not going to go into that too much. Yeah, let's skip that as well. There are some other parts of progressive web apps not related to specifically a service worker, but other features that are related to kind of the idea. So the idea behind progressive web app is not just like the service worker. The idea is to bring native functionality to the web. And that's what progressive web app means. It's a really like strange term that kind of gets overused. It's been used for, I don't know, a decade now, and it's kind of shifted in what it's meant over the years. But that's essentially what it means now, is I want to bring native functionality to the web. And so there are other things that have been kind of popping up over the last couple years. So background sync, the idea being that I can now send a request, and this is something that we did at Pinterest and actually ended up recovering about 400,000 requests a day. You send a request, and if the network is off or the request fails, you can queue it up so that when the network comes back online, I can replay the request. So this is really important for things like if you're logging information, right? If you have some logging call that's saying like someone did something. So what I was saying is Pinterest had 400,000 requests per day that were being lost because of network issues. And because of background sync, we recovered all of that information. So that means there's a lot of people doing things that we didn't know about, which is actually really, really cool. Image capture is a way of giving more access to the camera in the web. The Web Share API is a way of invoking the native share sheet. So instead of having like weird hacks to like URLs that redirect and things, you get like direct access to the native share sheet, so you can share to other apps, which is really cool. Credential management is great for streamlining your sign up and login flows. It actually ended up increasing a lot of our signups and logins when we introduced it. And the device memory API is not used a whole lot, but essentially it means that like you get access to how much memory is left on the device. All right, so we revised some more history at this point. We now have the bestest mobile web version. It's existent. And I want to download your super fast progressive web app. Pinterest, love it. Much nicer. All right, so the results. Well, you've all been waiting for. And before I go into that, sorry, you got all excited. One other lesson. So remember the first lesson that I said was metrics do not measure sentiment. That's super important. And the second is beware legacy assumptions. So there was a lot of things when we were building the mobile web that we kept comparing. We were like, oh, well, it's not going to work because mobile web is not as engaging as native app. Like we have all of this information from previously. Like, well, actually, like what you're saying is that the old horrible mobile web was less engaging than our really good native app. But now that our mobile web is really good, that's a legacy assumption that you cannot assume anymore, and that's something that you got to start trying out. Okay, so let's look at some performance metrics first. My favorite one is the second one. The time to interactive went from 23 seconds down to 5.6 seconds. That's a big difference. The JS bundle size went from 720 kilobytes to 150, and that is very, very related to time to interactive. And the CSS bundle size, we actually only, in our new mobile web, have 6 kilobytes of inline CSS into our HTML. That's in our app shell, and no other CSS. So there are no network requests for CSS for our mobile web, which is pretty cool. All right, and here are some graphs just showing the changes when we turned on the new mobile web. These are the kind of things you want to see. And last but not least, the final count. If I want to show you nothing else other than this, signups have increased 704% year over year for mobile web. That is insane. 700%. I don't think I've ever seen something like that before. It's crazy. I mean, it was really bad before, so that was part of it, but it is really good now. So impressions, essentially, like how many pins have you seen? That's how we make money, and those have increased like 290 to 300%. Like that means that we are now making way more money on mobile web than we were making previously, which is awesome. The time spent increased 290%. That's like a good example of engagement and showing how good your app is how long people are spending time. And that's it. Here are some bonus links if you're interested. Our mobile web was talked about in a couple different talks at Chrome Dev Summit last year. And this PWA performance case study was the talk I talked about from Adi Osmani. And then these bottom two are some open source projects from Pinterest. I'm going to throw these slides up on Twitter later. So I am at Zack Argyle if you want to follow me, and I'll have those up there. So I'm not going to do that really.